November 3rd. We started again downhill, the road being very rough and rocky, with rocks of all sizes and colors. Some of them are striped red and white, with the stripes about a foot apart. We came 6 miles to the toll gate, where we had to pay $1.50 for the wagon. We stopped and bought barley and feed. There is one family living here, right on the creek between the mountains. We came 12 miles, then stopped at a ranch to water, and there's 2 unreadable lines here. We then came on 12 miles over good roads to San Bernardino. The ground was covered with prickly pears. Some of the men stopped and got some of the pears to eat. This is a valley surrounded by mountains. We are camped on Warm Creek at an old bachelor's by the name of Eldridge. We are very much dissatisfied with the looks of the people and the country. They turned the horses on grass. We expect to stay here to rest and then go on to Los Angeles. November 4th. A beautiful morning, clear and cool. Frank is making Annie a coffin. We took her out of the wagon and laid her in the house. She will be buried this evening at 3 o'clock at the graveyard in this place. One of our freighters that came in with us brought us a handkerchief full of grapes to eat. Sunday, November 5th. Cool and pleasant. We all feel more homesick than ever. I feel like I could cry my eyes out. The people came around the wagons all day to see what we look like. One of the mules are gone. Frank has gone to hunt for it. During the days recorded in these entries, the Shackelfords were in the territories of the Tongva, the Yuhaviyetim, Maranga Yam, also known as Serrano, and the Keech. I'm Jen Glabius, and this is the Helnaki Deep Dive, a podcast about the process of mapping and analysis for historical and archaeological research using open source tools. In this episode, I'll discuss the ending of Ruth Shackelford's 1865 diary, which I just read the last 3 entries of. And I'll talk about how entering her diary entries is just the beginning of this research. Then I have an update on the mapping process, which is mostly about how I'm in the middle of finding and mapping locations from this 1865 diary. Let's dive in. I just read the last 3 entries of Ruth Shackelford's 1865 diary in the intro, and it's not an encouraging set of entries. The Shackelfords arrive in San Bernardino. They went via the Cajon Pass. A few days before they actually reached San Bernardino, little Annie, who was the Gatewood's daughter, had passed away, and they carried her body with them until they reached San Bernardino so she could be buried there instead of in the desert, since they had been following the Mojave Desert and traveling there. The path that the Shackelfords followed after they left Salt Lake City, they go through southern Utah, across the southern tip of Nevada, going through Las Vegas, which had the best springs in the area. And then they travel across Southern California. And they were following a path that was mostly established by Mormons starting in 1847, just after the founding of Salt Lake City. They followed Indigenous people's trails, but established this route from Salt Lake City to Los Angeles. Also established outposts in Las Vegas and places in southern Utah. I'll post a link to a description of this route that was established. It's an article from 1939 about the Mormon Corridor, which is interesting. So I just want to summarize a few things. So in the November 3rd entry, Ruth says that they're in San Bernardino, but they intend to rest a bit and then move on possibly to Los Angeles in a few days. They don't actually do that. I'll get to the 1868 diary starting on the next episode, but I do know that the Shackelfords remained in San Bernardino. I don't know why. They didn't actually go on to Los Angeles, but they stayed where they were until they decided to travel back to Missouri in 1868. Let's look at this 1865 diary. The very first entry, when the Shackelfords are leaving Clark County, Missouri, Ruth Shackelford says that they were traveling with two other families. So it was the Shackelfords, the Gatewoods, and the Rhines. Now, the Shackelfords were Ruth, the author of the diary, and her husband, William Frank. She refers to him entirely as Frank in this diary, so that's how I'm going to refer to him as well. On this trip, the Shackelfords have 5 children, aged 2 to 9. All of their own children survived this trip. I was confused about this earlier on in the process. Ruth Shackelford doesn't provide first and last names for people who pass on, and she refers very familiarly to different children and people. And so I had somewhat thought that one of her children had passed on, but that wasn't the case. 5 children, they all survived this trip, with the youngest being 2 years old. The second family with them was Atwood Gatewood's family. And the Shackelfords were related to him by marriage because Atwood Gatewood's wife, Anne, was Anne Shackelford, Frank's older sister. And the Gatewoods, when they start out, they have 7 children, ranging in age from 1 to 16. 3 of these children, the oldest, Mary, and then the 2 youngest, Jeffy and Annie, all passed away during this trip, as well as Anne Shackelford Gatewood. And so this was a very rough trip for them, and for the Shackelfords, because they were very close with the Gatewoods at this point throughout the trip. They traveled together, they worked together. After Anne passes away, the sick children, Jeffy and then Annie, travel in the Shackelfords' wagon, so they're working really almost as one unit throughout this. So the third family who was traveling with the Shackelfords all the way from Clark County, Missouri to San Bernardino is the family of Isaac Rhine. And this family consisted of his 3 daughters, Susan, Mary, and Maggie, since his wife had passed away previously. Now, their family remains intact throughout this journey. And the Rhines, even though they travel with the Shackelfords, but they don't seem quite as close. There are many references to the Rhines, especially Mary Rhine. She might have been especially close with Ruth Shackelford. And the Miss Rhines in general are discussed. But once they reach California, all of them, the Shackelfords, Gatewoods, and the Rhines, stay in San Bernardino at first. But in 1868, when the Gatewoods and the Shackelfords decide to return, they decide to go to Texas and possibly back to Missouri, the Rhines instead move to Los Angeles. And information about this comes from a biography, very short biography of Isaac Rhines, which gives where he was born and who his parents were and his wife's family. And this is an illustrated history of Los Angeles, and I'll post a link to where you can find that if you're curious. So at the end of this trip, these 3 families, the Shackelfords, Gatewoods, and Rhines, had traveled a distance of over 1,800 miles. 1,800 miles as if they had gone straight through Missouri to California using modern highways. It was much longer, the route that they had to take in their covered wagons in 1865. It took them just over 6 months, so 187 days, setting out on May 1st and then arriving in San Bernardino on November 3rd, as I read. And Ruth Shackelford's diary ends 2 days later on November 5th. So I don't know if she just ended it because that was the end of that time or because they were no longer traveling. But we don't have information about, at least I haven't found any information right now about the Shackelfords in California. One possible source, if the timing had been different, would have been the U.S. Census, possibly. I've looked at the 1860 census records for the Shackelfords, which gave me information about some of their children. But since the Shackelfords travels occurred 1865 to 1868, that's not during a census year. And so there's no record, except as far as I can tell, Ruth's diary, that they were in California at all. There might be other records related to California that I don't know about. And if any of you do know about any records, I would love to hear about them so I can search them out. But at this point, I have no idea what the Shackelfords did in California and San Bernardino for 2.5 years. So, along with having questions about what the Shackelfords did in California, I also have so many questions still about this 1865 journey. And all of them require more research, which I love research, so this is great. This is the beginning for really, this part is the beginning of this research. The first thing I wanted to do was the mapping. And while the mapping isn't done, I have enough that I can start thinking a little bit about the next part. So I have many questions. Here are a couple. Number one, why exactly did they leave Missouri? Ruth Shackelford never describes why they leave Missouri, and they must not have been that tied to remaining in California. Otherwise, they would have stayed longer. Instead, they're there for under 3 years, and then they travel to Texas and on back to Missouri. So I am curious about that. I'm also super curious about the path that they took in 1865 and whether it was influenced by events occurring around them. So 1865 was the last year of the Civil War. There were Indigenous uprisings, so the start of the so-called Plains Indian Wars across Nebraska and Wyoming and Colorado and that area. Yet I'm curious, why did they go through Utah and use the southern route? Was it because they arrived too late and they were worried about snow and being trapped and not being able to make it going the straighter route to San Francisco? Or were they aiming for Los Angeles originally? And so this is a better route for actually getting there because then they wouldn't have to travel within California as much. It's hard to say. And what I know to this point is the little bits I've described in this podcast where I've looked up things here and there. But mostly what I have is what Ruth Shackelford wrote, and she gives very little information about motivations. And I might never learn their motivations. But what I really would like to do is provide more context for their journey and dive deeper into what she wrote about. So some possible additions to the research, things that I would like to go and do after I do the initial location entries for the 1868 diary, because that's next. After that, I'd like to go through both diaries and tag people. So I've been reading the entries and trying to get a vague sense of family. I just looked up census records and family records for the Rhines, the Shackelfords, and the Gatewoods, and that finally gave me a better understanding of their families. But what would be useful is going through and tagging all the people. Especially one family I'm interested in are the Kirklands, who they seem to meet up with. The Kirklands are also from Missouri, and they travel together to California. So the Kirklands seem to become close friends on the journey, although very early, the first couple of times Ruth refers to them in her diary, she misspells their last name. Their family isn't especially described in the 1865 diary, but they must have been close because in 1868, when the Shackelfords and Gatewoods decide to go to Texas, the Kirklands go with them. And so I would like to look deeper into that friendship, see if I can see it developing through mentions in Ruth Shackelford's 1865 diary. Couple other things I could go back and tag, and I might do this before people because people will be complicated. Tagging weather events. When does it rain? When is it cold? When is it windy? Just as an information. that could be correlated with other data down the line. I just think weather is interesting, and I'm interested in how the weather affected their travel plans. Also, I want to tag the landscape and what Ruth Shackelford says about the landscape. She does note different places. I believe in Wyoming, she talks about the formation of rocks that look like houses. And in the November 3rd entry, which I read at the beginning of the show, she talks about the striped rocks and their colors. So I'm curious, I hadn't really noticed her noting these things. So I'm eager to go back and tag these things because I think that's a way for me to understand them is by focusing on any mentions of these things, and also a way to possibly correlate them with locations. So we'll see. Other things, Ruth Shackelford pays a lot of attention to graves, especially early on. It seems like she stops doing that at some point, and her feelings on death, like especially since so many members of her family of the Gatewood family pass away on this journey, that I feel like she at some point no longer focuses on the graves. And is that because there weren't graves, or she no longer can focus on it because she has experienced so much death of family members on this trip, of her sister-in-law and nieces and nephews? And then another thing so the biggest thing is to give context for the travel. So understanding where were the places where the Shackelfords both passed and stopped, how established were they, what types of people were living there, different things like that. And this includes different forts and stations, which like Fort Kearney, Fort Halleck, places like that. What were they doing there? Were they well established? Different information about that. Just give a bit more context and color to the Shackelfords. Another big topic I'm interested in is Indigenous territories that the Shackelfords traveled through and the Shackelfords' relations with Indigenous peoples. And this is an ongoing issue. And because I want to, in this work, recognize the hard travails that the Shackelfords went through and Ruth Shackelford went through making this journey in 1865 by wagon train. It was not easy. It was hard. They had food shortages, went through difficult terrain. But the Shackelfords' travels as part of the great movement of people into the Western United States displaced Indigenous peoples and was a continuing process of displacement of Indigenous peoples that had been occurring since colonial times in North America. And so part of the context I want to give is the Shackelfords' part in this displacement. And also, what can we tell about relations between white people, especially, and Indigenous peoples through Ruth Shackelford's diaries? I haven't talked so much about how Ruth Shackelford referred to Indigenous peoples. In the last episode on Sweet Freedom's Plains, I discussed how Ruth Shackelford only referred to Black people in the context of Black soldiers in her 1868 diary. Ruth Shackelford in this 1865 diary only refers to Indigenous peoples as Indians. She refers to some women, Indigenous women, who live in a cabin as Sioux, but only because they refer to themselves in that way. Ruth Shackelford does not otherwise distinguish between the Plains Indigenous tribes or the mountainous Great Basin and desert Indigenous peoples that she comes across. Her attitude towards Indigenous peoples definitely is different throughout the journey, especially through the plains, and partly the mountains. So through what's Nebraska into Wyoming, there's a lot of fear about Indigenous peoples, and they're all on guard. by the time after reaching Utah, so Salt Lake City, her attitude becomes more like they're a nuisance. So there are some episodes of horses and livestock getting away, possibly by Indigenous peoples. And otherwise, she talks a lot about Indigenous peoples being kind of like begging around camp, and it seems like she's referring to them as a nuisance. Part of what I'm going to do is go through when I have all the locations and actually match up which Indigenous territories were the Shackelfords traveling through and try to match that up with any mentions of Indigenous peoples and just try to get a better sense of the Shackelfords' place in the context of the displacement and overall genocide of Indigenous peoples in the Western United States. So these are some of my long-term plans. Immediately, I would like to create maps of their journey, which I can start to do, but not quite, because I'm still in the middle of the process of mapping. So let's talk about the mapping a little bit. So with this episode, I've finished the initial logging of the 1865 diary entries. So I had decided early on to focus just on tagging locations at this point, ignoring people and other events, so I could leave that for later. And this tagging process seems to be a 3-step process. So the first step was adding all the diary entries to NoteGoat, tagging locations, whether or not I knew where they were, and for any place I could easily identify, I added latitude and longitude, or a shapefile if it's a river or a stream that I could identify. The second step is to add other named or identifiable places from historical maps. So match them up, hopefully, with historical maps. And I'm going to be using the David Rumsey collection of historic maps online, and I'll put a link to that collection. I've mentioned it before, it's a great resource. But when I do this step, I'll be looking at the maps in QGIS and adding information there that I'll then put back into NoteGoat. So updating the locations that don't actually have location information, where they are, that just have a name. And then step 3 will be to use clues and context from the diary and all of the places that are already located through the maps and other sources. And this will be primarily to map any campsites, so places that are not in a town. But Ruth would say we went on 12 miles and then we camped for the night beside a stream, and sometimes there's really good information. Mostly I'm going to have to try to look from point to point of already identified places that they passed through or stopped, and then I'll estimate where they actually would have reached. And so all of these locations, most of their campsites are not in any towns. And so there's going to be a lot of these, and all of these are going to be tagged as very uncertain when I'm looking at the location certainty. So I'm in step 2. I'd already done some of the identification from historic maps early on, some of the places in Iowa, and then I stopped around after I figured out Dogtown a few episodes ago, but I had decided to focus on just getting all the places done because it's easier with maps to already have the places, and then if the map covers a large area, it's easier to just go, oh, and this place, and this place, and this place, and tag them all. And in the next week, I'm going to add a video to my Patreon of how to open georeferenced maps from the David Rumsey collection in QGIS. So it's a really simple process, and I give a walkthrough in a video that will be posted this week. And that video will be available to any supporter on Patreon. So if you support me for at least $2 per month, then you get access to all the behind the scenes videos and information. Just if you're asking why should I fund the Halanaki on Patreon, There are costs to producing and hosting this podcast, and it would be great if I could get some help with that. If you like the show and you're like, yes, Jen, keep going. Yes, I want to keep hearing the Halanaki Deep Dive. You could help support that. There's also the issue of research materials. All the research I'd like to do, all the ideas I have coming up, they require resources that I don't necessarily have right now. So since now is the time of COVID-19, I've been using things that I can find online. If it's an older book or article, I can often find it online. Newer things, I don't have access to any university resources. Since I'm not affiliated with an academic institution, I can't go and use any libraries right now. Hopefully, once we're past the pandemic, the worst stages, universities will open up their libraries again to the public, and then I would be able to go in and look at books. Otherwise, I'm going to have to rent or purchase books and articles. And so if you decide to support me on Patreon, then you help support the further research. So with that, I have a lot to do with this 1865 diary. And going through this and this process, looking at things, mapping out what locations I could, I've learned a lot about Ruth Shackelford's journey. But I also feel like I've barely scratched the surface, that there's so much more. So while I'm at the ending of the 1865 diary of the initial logging, I'm in the middle of the mapping and just at the very beginning of the research process. Also, starting in the next episode, I'll start going through the beginning of the 1868 diary. And so we all have that to look forward to. You can email questions or comments to deepdive@helenaki.com or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at HelanakiGIS. Show notes with links to resources mentioned in this episode are available on the Helenaki website and on Patreon. If you enjoy the Helenaki Deep Dive, please recommend it to a friend or leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can find it. You can also support the Halanaki Deep Dive financially by becoming a supporter on Patreon. For as little as $2 per month, you get access to behind-the-scenes content, while higher tiers of support include digital copies of maps and other visualizations related to the podcast. The Halanaki Deep Dive is written and produced by me, Jen Globius of the Halanaki. The theme music is Deep Ocean Instrumental by Dan O of danosongs.com. Thanks for listening.